Well, good morning. It's good to see each of you this morning. We certainly have experienced in the last week the highs of the heat and the beautiful morning this morning. Wow. We could have had church outside at 6 o'clock. It would have been great. It's hard to believe that we're already in June. Didn't we just have our New Year's celebrations? Goodness gracious, how did we get this far along already? Where's the time gone? Well, when I wondered about that, I went to the great theologian, Dr. Seuss, and he writes this. How did we get to June so fast? It's night before it's afternoon. December is here before it's June. It was summer before it was spring. How did it get so late so soon? Time is passing fast. The clock continues to tick. We are in the last of the series, the 6th week of the series that we have been in entitled Amazed. And looking at Jesus' miraculous teaching, he had been on the mountain and he had taught for 3 chapters in Matthew's Gospel. Matthew 5, 6, and 7 is termed the Sermon on the Mount. What does that mean? He's on the mountain with people, lots of people. And he's teaching the core values of what it means to follow Jesus. If somebody asks you, or if you want to know, how do I find out really what it means to follow Jesus? Read Matthew 5, 6, and 7. It will give us what we need to live life with God and with each other. It's a great place. After the teaching, though, he came down from the mountain, and we've been looking at the series of miracles as he comes down from the mountain, begins to talk about how life is lived when we bring heaven to earth. And it's been a great series. I don't know if it has been for you, but it certainly has for me. You have an outline. You can get that out. Before we jump into this morning's teaching, though, I'd like to have us go back and just click through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 quickly from where we have been. Sometimes it's good to look back a little bit. Week 1, we talked about a beggar who pushed his way toward Jesus. And Jesus is teaching, and Jesus is teaching into, and I would call it permission-giving authority to break down barriers, and he did that by touching what the culture has deemed unclean, a beggar that had very contagious disease. The beggar did something that we don't forget either, because he had confidence enough that knowing that he was supposed to be in the leper colony, he stepped in and pushed through the crowd and come to Jesus and made this statement. Jesus, you can heal me if you want to. Remember what Jesus did? He reached out and he touched him first and he said, I will heal you. Go and be healed. Wow. Second week, it was a Roman centurion who had a servant that was ill. And he comes to Jesus and said, I have a servant ill, but please don't. He didn't feel worthy enough to have Jesus come under his own roof. He even says that. I don't deserve to have you come under my roof. Just say the words, and my servant will be healed. The Roman centurion, was operating in a culture where the divide between the Roman government, which was in charge, and the Jewish community, who was the religious group, was very clear. And for the Jewish community, if you couldn't trace your bloodline back to Abraham, you were an outsider. And so he lived in that great divide. He had everything wrong except the only thing that really mattered: coming to Jesus with a humble and open heart. Likewise, the religious insiders had everything right except the one thing that really mattered: coming to Jesus with a humble and open heart. Jesus affirmed the Roman centurions, demonstrating his permission-giving authority to break down ethnic barriers. We live in a culture that has an incredible ethnic divides. And we would be better for it if we had more color in the room, I believe. But I've grown up with more of us Caucasian people than otherwise. But in our culture today, the persons of color sense and know that there's dissonance in places. And how can we be a people that step into those? I think that's the call for us. The next week was Jesus healing Peter's mother-in-law. And it was kind of like, well, was Peter married? I didn't know that. Yeah, he was. or he wouldn't have had a mother-in-law. And Jesus healed her, and as minute she got up, she began to serve the people in her household. Had the gift of serving, had the gift of hospitality. And Jesus did a couple things that cross through these barriers and he brings authority, permission-given authority to cross the barriers of the Sabbath and heal on the Sabbath. And secondly, to touch a woman. And in most of these miracles, and even today, the women were in the culture less than men, and so they aren't given names except mother-in-law. So, I would say to you as women today in this church, in Journey, we affirm and welcome your gifts. God affirms and welcomes the gifts of every person. Every single one of us here today are a valued son and daughter of God. Some of you, that's all you need to hear today. Because we have not been affirmed a lot in our culture. The fourth week we talked about Jesus and his friends getting into a boat. They had ministered, they were tired to get in a boat. Jesus goes down, takes a nap. Sea of Galilee looks clear, and all of a sudden, bang, here comes a storm like a thunderstorm that brings hail in Kansas sometimes. And the boat's waffling, and they call out to Jesus, we're going to drown in this thing. He stands up and said, be still. And the disciples look at each other, it's like, the wind and the waves obeyed him. We thought he was a man, but he's God in the flesh. Wow. Jesus demonstrates there permission-giving authority to break through the barriers of our fears. Derek talked a lot about that. We talked about that on that week, that we all carry fears. Fears of, we could just give a list. What are the fears that you carry? What are the fears that we sometimes internalize? And they become big and they hold us from experiencing all that God would have for us. Last week, week 5. By the way, we have one of the greatest teachers around in Eric Miller, Pastor Eric. You all know that. And we appreciate he and his family dearly and deeply. We have a great teachers team at Yoder, and Jim Osmond, our pastor at Mac. And this morning, as he's teaching about right now, he's also mourning the loss of his stepdad of 30-some years. So we carry that today with us. Jesus, last week, goes to Capernaum, a city where he did a lot of his ministry from. Wealthy city, multicultural city, with Roman and Greek influence. The dress, the politics, the religious thought was all kind of Roman and Greek thought. But Jesus demonstrates his authority in a paralyzed man by not saying, go and be healed, but your sins are forgiven. And the religious leaders who were trying to corner Jesus, and we didn't know what to do with him, saying, how could you say that? You're not God. That's blaspheming. And Jesus looked at them, and he recognized that the person that needed healing was paralyzed spiritually and physically. He came to demonstrate his authority again to break through and offer forgiveness of sin and healing, physical healing. He challenged Christ's followers of all times. As God has sent me, I am sending you. And as you go, John writes, you will do the things that I have done and greater things. There's a song like that. Greater things are still to come. Greater things are yet to be done here. That's in amongst us personally and out where we're doing life for sure. Between the last Sunday and where we are today, and it's page 887 in the Red Bibles, if you haven't found that, it's Matthew 9:18 to 26. There's an interlude between last week and this week, and two little short stories that are worthy of our stop and just looking at a little bit. Jesus is walking through town, and Matthew is a tax collector. Matthew's the person that wrote this book and the stories that we're looking at right here. But he's a tax collector working for the Roman government, but a Jew, and the Jews hated it. Because there was no grid for sure about how many taxes to collect. A suggestion, but you could get wealthy by getting more than that. So the public enemy number one almost in the culture was the Jews who worked for the Romans. He was one of those, and Jesus looked at him when he went by and said, Matthew, follow me. He just left everything. His security, his wealth. because he realized that there's something bigger than just what I could accumulate in the masses of my possessions. And he followed Jesus. That evening, Jesus gathered with him in his home for a meal. And he has some of his tax-collecting friends. And of course, the religious leaders come and they're trying to corner Jesus all the time, find fault. And they can say, how could you eat with this riffraff? Again, Jesus is trying to demonstrate a different kind of way to offer to us a demonstration of how we're to live life, and to recognize that many of Jesus' encounters that were deep and transforming were at meal times with people. And many of those were not with the religious community. Yeah, encourages you and I as we live out this call together. How do we bless people and eat with people? That was a series some time ago. Encourages me to continue to try to reach out to people and have meals with other people. So then the next little excerpt is about John the Baptist's disciples are fasting, which means go without food for the purpose of spending that time in the worship of God. And but they were doing it more for the sake of being seen. It was more about keeping the rules than it was about the transformation of the heart. And Jesus was coming in to break that down and say it's more about your relationship personally with God the Father through me. The newness of the gospel could not be condemned with the legalism of what they were trying to practice any more than you could sew a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, because if you wash it, it's going to get all distorted. John even writes about that in chapter 1, verse 17, where he says, the Old Testament law came from Moses, but God's unfailing love and faithfulness came through Jesus Christ. Wow. So this is where this gets us up to today. And so follow along as I read, again, Jesus giving authority and permission in Matthew 8:18 to 26. While he was saying this, well, what in the world was he saying? It makes us ask a question, doesn't it? While he was saying this, well, just these two encounters. While they were having these conversations about Matthew and being a tax collector, and he's going to follow Jesus and going to be a person that Jesus saw maybe detail in, because he wrote what we're reading from right now, by the way. So while they had that conversation and the conversation about fasting, a Roman ruler walks in that Mark and Luke give a name to. His name is Jairus. And he knelt before Jesus and said, my daughter just died. But come and put your hand on her, and she'll live. Jesus got up and went with them, and so did his disciples. So they're on their way toward Jairus' house. An interruption of the evening. They probably had the day already ended, and they're just kind of trying to relax together. Just then, as they're heading that way, a woman who had an issue of bleeding for 12 years came up behind Jesus and touched the edge of his cloak. And she said to herself, if only I could touch his cloak, I'll be healed. And Jesus turned to her and said, take heart, daughter, your faith has healed you. The woman was healed from that moment on. Wow. So it's interruption in the evening from Jairus. And as they go toward his house, it's interruption 2.0 from the lady who had bleeding. Now we get to Jairus' house. When Jesus, verse 23, entered Jairus' house, saw the flute players and the noisy crowd, he said, just go away. The girl's not dead, but asleep. They laughed at him. After the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took the girl by the hand, and she got up. Of course, the news spread all over the region. We begin this series, this section, with a request from the Father, a father's request. A father's request. My daughter is ill. Now, Jairus, to understand him a little bit, he was a leader of the synagogue. The synagogue was a place where at least 10 families gathered for worship. It was their worship center. Years earlier, everybody went to Jerusalem to worship, but when they were scattered due to captivity, they were gathered, and Jairus was a leader. His responsibilities was for supervising the worship, taking care of the building, running the weekday school, settling conflicts, and getting a rabbi to teach on weekends. Tremendous influence in the community, a person of great respect. Yet he was willing to leave that all and come to Jesus because death had crept into his house. He had possibly exhausted all of his own efforts for his daughter's healing and was now in need of the only person who could change that, and that was Jesus. He went to Jesus, and he didn't just go in and say, "Hi, I'm Jairus. I've got a daughter who passed away. Come with me. I've got a car out front or a chariot out front. We need to speed toward our place." No, he came in and bowed down. Offered a humble heart to start with. Desperation, my friends, has a way of bringing us to our knees. Desperation sometimes brings us to, when we've tried everything else, when we've exhausted all of our own efforts. God, this is beyond what I can manage. This is beyond what I can handle. This is beyond me. And this is Jairus' kind of thoughts. Jesus, I know if you touch her. How did he know? Evidently, he had been on the edge as kind of the leader of the synagogue watching Jesus, or he wouldn't have had this kind of faith to step up. To say, if you'll just come and lay your hand on her. It was kind of the same thing that happened when Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law. Put his hand, he touched her, and she got up. There's meaningfulness in the touch. To this point, Jesus had never performed a miracle miracle on people who, except those that were still alive. This was the first time that he would step into one where a person had actually passed away. Jairus' faith in God is evident in his bold statement that the touch would return her life. We also know in the first miracle of the leper, what did Jesus do when the leper said, "Jesus, I know you can heal me if you want to." He reached out and touched, which would have made him unclean right out of the chute. So Jesus wasn't afraid to step through the stuff of our lives and step in and to get in the mess of life. Wow. It wasn't a scheduled appointment, by the way. It's a lesson in it for me and maybe for you, that Jairus' example gives me, and I hope you, a great example of faith. Do I come regularly to God in a humble kind of way? Do I? Not all the time for me. But that's the invitation from Jairus' example. The second thing I think that's important here is Jesus' deep love for people. Do I love people, or are people just a means to an end? Do I have deep relationships, or do I wall myself off? We're created for relationships. And Jesus demonstrates deep love for people. As we interact with people, whether it's children, students, adults, senior adults, there are great occasions for serving, and some of those come at unscheduled times. Some of the greatest occasions for serving are during or ministering or being with someone is unscheduled. I did a memorial service on Wednesday for a family that I had done a memorial service for Helen's husband, James, 20 years ago. And I didn't know him at the time. I happened to be in the elevator at the hospital. And as I come down, a family gets on very distraught. And so I asked a few questions. I got back to the office and they called and said, "Would you consider doing our father's memorial service, James Goebel?" And so when Mom died a week ago, they went back and looked through things and said, "We don't have a church." It's like, I didn't know them. It's an interruption. But yeah, you step in. And you're aware when you step in, folks, the importance of saying yes and stepping into those situations with a group, with a family that come from Washington and Seattle and Texas gathered. Interruptions. Jesus was able to find ways to minister in interruptions. The official story about Jairus come to Jesus for healing is suspended in the center part of this text, where as they go to Jairus' house, all of a sudden a woman comes up who had suffered a hemorrhage of a blood disorder, and some would say it was like a bleeding of her uterus. I don't know for sure, but it had hampered her, and she was put on the edge of society because she wasn't healthy, just like a leper. No one could associate with her, nor could she do life like everyone else could. But Jesus wasn't afraid to be interrupted. He was okay with it. He was interrupted when he was speaking to a crowd. He was interrupted when he was working with his disciples. He was interrupted while he was traveling, while he was praying, while he was sleeping on the boat. Are you and I okay in our regular, ordinary life to be interrupted? Because every conversation you and I have, God is already there. And it may be an opportunity for you and I to be Jesus in that setting. Tightly packed are the hurts of people right around us. Did you hear that? Tightly packed are the hurts of people right around you and I. And a question or just stopping and being interested might be exactly what God wants for you. Well, she had this disease. As, again, the leper was unclean and was outside. This woman was unclean and to be avoided. She did not want to trouble Jesus, so she wanted to just touch his garment, because if he would have reached and touched her, the Jewish law would say he would have been unclean. But if she could sneak up and touch the hem of his garment, maybe nobody would get that in the public view, and Jesus wouldn't be declared unclean. She didn't want to make it public. She wanted to be very anonymous, and again, she's a woman with no name. Wow. What we do know in this series, Amazed, is that Jesus came to bring spiritual, relational, emotional, and physical healing. And it's in our times of desperation. We don't have to worry if it's the correct theology to come to God. We can just come to God and say, God, I can't find my way. Maybe it's a test from the doctor that's uncertain. Maybe it's a relationship that's broken. You fill in the blanks. You fill in the blanks. Jesus is seeking to draw each of us to his center, to recognize that when we come with a humble and open heart, Jesus is ready, especially when we reach our hands out. It has to be it's us. His hands are always open. But it's us. Have you made the effort to press through the crowd of your unbelief or your busyness or your entertainment or your activities? Can you name the what and the who that's in the crowd that stands between you and Jesus? What is it that stands there that keeps you and I from being fully on and enjoying the life and freedom in Jesus to the fullest? Wow. Jairus was a leader in the synagogue. And his daughter had passed away. His daughter had been healthy for 12 years and had died. The woman who had been ill for 12 years was now whole after Jesus said, daughter, go and be healed. Now we would think that Jairus would have gotten he'd gotten a little impatient. It's like, Jesus, we're heading toward my house. We don't have time for this. I think that was intentional on Jesus' part, because I think it was a growing faith thing for Jairus to realize that our walk with God isn't about a destination always, but it's the walk that's important. And it's the time and how we use our time We talked earlier about how fast it's gone to get to June. Yeah, it is. And it'll be a snap of the finger, and it'll be Christmas. And we have the same amount of time. How are you and I using it? The Father's request then, when they got to the house, Jesus sees the flute players. It's kind of interesting, and a lot of noisy disorder. And already a crowd had gathered and was mourning. Now in that culture, you would pay to have mourners come in, and the more influential you were, the more mourners you could have, the longer they would stay. You would pay them. That was some kind of a cultural thing for for appraisal for you. But Jesus said, "Why don't you just leave?" Yeah. The girl's not dead. She's just asleep. They laughed. They did not understand. And I want to hold up to us that each time we take a step toward Jesus, each time we think in our own heads, I would like to step in with my humble and open heart and offer this fear, this doubt, this whatever to God. There's going to be doubters. There's going to be doubters that Satan brings in our own mind, comes in our own mind, and from outside. Oh, I wouldn't do that. No, I wouldn't do that. No. Mark writes that Jesus says words in the Hebrew. He takes the child by the hand and uses the words Talita Kuma, which means, little girl, rise up. Little girl, rise. In this setting, in raising this daughter to new life, Jesus is introducing something for us, a new language around death, that because he knows we will wake up again. All persons who have died will wake up again in the resurrection when Jesus comes again. Death is a temporary situation. Our lives go on for eternity. So we'd say, well, thank you, Howard. It's been good. This series has been good. But we have to ask a question in your outline. The question is what now? What now? And at the end of chapter 9, I think Jesus is going back to his own disciples and to us when Matthew writes these words, and follow along. Matthew 9, 35 to 38. Jesus traveled through all the towns, teaching in the synagogues, announcing the good news of the kingdom. He healed every kind of disease. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were confused and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Said to his disciples, the harvest is great, but the workers are few. So pray to the Lord who is in charge of the harvest. Ask him to send workers to the harvest field. And then chapter 10, verse 1. And he called his disciples and gave them authority to go to drive out evil spirits and to heal. He says, you preach the good news. The kingdom is here, is near. The harvest, we're heading toward wheat harvest in Kansas. You can't drive up and down a road and not see a field that's turning gold. Some of it might be by drought, some of it's by maturity. But we're heading toward the harvest of wheat. And Jesus said, the harvest is plentiful. What did he mean by that? That there are hundreds of people walking around on planet Earth, walking around in Reno County, walking around in your neighborhood, in the places you and I engage and interact with people that are like sheep without a shepherd. They're just doing life one day after the other without any focus and without any purpose in life. And he said, pray that the Lord of the harvest would send workers. You know who the workers are? Who do you think they are? It's Tim. Yeah. And it's Cliff. Yeah. And it's Dorinda. It's you and it's me. We're the workers. Because there's people within the realm of your association of people that will listen to you because of your integrity and your relationship with them, that won't listen and respond even to Eric as a good teacher or to me either, but they will to you. Will we step in and offer this love and forgiveness that we have experienced? That's the call for us as we leave this series. I believe it. And Jesus said the same thing to us as he said to Matthew. He didn't say, you have to come. No, we have a choice. When he told Matthew, follow me, 2 words. Matthew had a choice. I like my security, Jesus. Man, I'm setting up for like retirement, traveling. I'm getting it done. He walked away because of what was real and eternal was more important than what was temporal, that what he could put his hands on. And he calls us, you and I, today. He doesn't twist our arms. The call is, follow me. Follow me. Then he says at the end of his time here on earth, he said, peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you. Wow. Does that make sense to you and I, that we're the ones that are sent? And this God of heaven is the God of your life and mine personally. He's the God of the people in our neighborhoods. He's the God of the people in our communities. He's the God of the city. Yeah. I can't impact the city, nor the whole city, but maybe I can impact a few people by allowing even some interruptions, and maybe you can too. It's one life at a time, because lost people matter to God. Does that make sense? Yeah. May we be known for a people that have experienced the grace and love and forgiveness of Jesus and walk with people with open hands toward Jesus. May we be known as that kind of a people. Thank you, Lord, for our time in this series and for our time today. God, we thank you for Matthew, who was called by you and could write these words so well put for us to read today, to be challenged and encouraged that as we follow you and live like you, you are going to be with us. You're going to give us the power, the courage, the confidence that when we share with people, your presence is already there. We thank you. In Jesus' name, amen.